Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and I've got a double whammy of fantastic guests today. Joining me from Shepherd University is Jen Murray. Jen, how are you today?
Very well, Chris. Thank you for having us this afternoon.
Really delighted to have you back. And then joining us from Oklahoma State University is John Kinder. John, how are you today?
I'm doing great, thanks.
This is it's exciting to have you on for the first time. Thanks for taking some time to chat with us today.
Oh, no problem.
So, you two have collaborated on a really neat essay collection called They Are Dead and Yet They Live, which could also sound like a zombie movie, I suppose. But
Yes.
it's a book about Civil War memories in a polarized America. Jen, tell me a little bit about how the two of you got together on this and where the idea came from.
Great question. And Chris, thanks again for having me to talk about our book. It comes out on February 1st. So I was in Oklahoma State teaching there for 7 years before I took the job as the director of the Civil War Center here at Shepherd. And John is my colleague who specializes in war and society and has written a number of projects on World War II and World War I. And I think the origins of this really came out of the tumultuous summer of 2020 with the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests that we see permeated across the national landscape. And if I recall, the real origins to this, I think John and I exchanged some emails about doing a public lecture at Oklahoma State that would look at questions of Civil War monuments and specifically the appropriateness of Confederate monuments on our national landscape and the way in which, in reaction to the murder of George Floyd, we saw increased conversations about whether or not Confederate monuments should remain in this polarized world that we then inhabited. So out of that email exchange came a public lecture. It was actually a roundtable panel that we did in November, I think, of 2021. And our department chair, Brian Hosmer, moderated it. And John and I were participants. And one of our colleagues in geography, Rebecca Sheehan, was the third participant. And each of us looked at a particular aspect of the Civil War memory and how Civil War memory permeates American culture. I talked about Confederate monuments and some of the origins of the placements of Confederate monuments in the years right after the Civil War to sort of springboard and contextualize the discussion about the appropriateness of Confederate monuments. So that talk was it was well received. We had good attendance that cold November afternoon, and after that, I think I have this story right, John. I got an email from you, I believe, saying essentially, would you be interested in building on that roundtable discussion into a edited volume about Civil War memory in modern America? And John is a great thinker. I owe a lot of this project to him in terms of how it's been conceptualized. A lot of that is John's brilliant thinking on that. And of course, I said, absolutely. I've always thought and felt that there was something about the Civil War in modern America in the way in which it permeates our culture, our politics, our collective thinking, our media, the clothes we wear, the songs we listen to. It is everywhere. So the opportunity to bring together this all-star lineup of contributors that is really interdisciplinary and interdiscipline in nature was just wonderful. And to see and to showcase how important the American Civil War is, and to borrow a Lincoln phrase, how these mystic chords of memory resonate so much in modern culture is just wonderful. So I'm thrilled and really proud of this book, and happy to have a chance to showcase it to your listeners today, Chris.
Oh, we're great. Pleased to have you showcase it. So, John, does her memory of the book's origin jive with what you remember too?
Well, I should say that if you've been around Jen long enough, you know how incredibly modest she is. So here's basically my memory of it. It was exactly as she said, and it was for us, it was the first kind of sort of in-person event held after COVID. right? So we were first back, we hadn't seen each other for a long time, kind of in person, and it felt like a moment that was really timely. And I should say, and I'll admit this now. So when I asked Jen to do this project, of course, um, you know, uh, uh, I knew exactly who I was asking. And basically, what I thought was, look, I'm a scholar of war and society. I'm a scholar of contemporary America, 20th and 21st century America. But, and I was interested in this question, but there was no way that I could do this without like a real subject matter expert on uh, the Civil War itself. And so when I asked Jen, I think she sort of thought it might have been, me doing a favor asking her. It was completely the opposite way around, right? I knew that there was no way that I could even attempt to do this without someone like her. And so, you know, when it comes to everything in the book that in many ways, like if you ask, like, how did we get these people? Like, that's Jen, right? If it's a question of how did we decide which text to engage with? That's Jen, right? Jen is really responsible for the intellectual heft of this project. I was sort of tried to do my editing, tried to do my framing, tried to do, how do we think about these things as they relate to the present? Because that's ultimately what came out of that one day panel discussion was that here we have this event that took place so long ago, and yet not only the echoes of it can be heard today, but literal references to the meaning of the Civil War. And so that's where it came from, at least in my memory.
So let me ask you, John, because as a scholar who looks at more modern history, still issues of war in society, I think in many ways probably resonate. The times may change, but the issues in a lot of ways probably stay the same. What was it like for you as a modern scholar to then dip into the 19th century and look at these issues in the Civil War context?
Well, I mean, some of my work actually does get into the Civil War, get back toward this. But usually in my work, the Civil War is sort of the backdrop chapter, right? The Civil War is what I have to talk about in order to get to what I'm really going to talk about. And as little research as I've done in the Civil War, the one thing that's really struck me is that unlike even World War II, the degree of seriousness by which every little detail of the war, like things that in the conflicts that I look at, we sort of take for granted, are still being contested and are still being felt on a real kind of visceral level. That's not something that I'm actually used to. When I'm talking about World War One or even World War Two, it's sort of the broad frameworks for understanding those things, at least in the way that I wind up talking about them, are pretty solid, right? But and so that's what excited me thinking about the Civil War, was just because it was so contentious. Not only was the event contentious, but the interpretation, and then of course the memory, right? Because as Jen says, this is coming out of events that were taking place in 2020 and 2021, but even before then, these questions of what is America all about? What does America stand for? Right? What happens when we get too polarized as a country? Right? And on top of all of this was just this general chorus I kept hearing again and again in a lot of my of we're on the verge of a civil war. We're on the verge of a civil war. Civil War 2.0 is just around the corner. And for me, I kept thinking like, well, what does that actually mean? Like, what would that look like? When people sort of evoke the Civil War or a civil war, what literally are they talking about? And so that was just another reason why I was so happy when Jen and I were able to put this together, because it was able to uh, address some questions that I had personally. And, some of the answers I think that we came up with were not necessarily the ones that I would have initially conceived from the very beginning. So it was fruitful in that sense as well.
Yeah. It's funny when you talk about the, Civil War 2.0, and on rare occasions, someone will see emerging Civil War and they're like, right on, man, we're with you. And it's like, no, 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 that's not what that means. Jen, you're certainly familiar with this idea of the felt history of the Civil War. You've worked at Gettysburg. You have seen, people from all over the country in the millions come to these landscapes because they feel it in a way that they might not feel other parts of our own history.
Yeah, to be sure, and I'll say too, one important contribution of our book, Chris, is that John and I wanted to be very deliberate in not just rehashing the debate about Confederate monuments.
Yeah.
There's been so much scholarship written about Confederate monuments and the pervasiveness of the lost cause. Recent scholars like Karen Cox has looked at in her book No Common Ground has done a really good job of bringing the Confederate monument debate up to the present. So the historiography on that particular topic is incredibly rich. What John and I aimed to do was move the conversation in another direction. So, and maybe we'll have time to get into some of the individual chapters, but none of our contributors focus on Confederate monuments in the monument debate. We're looking at all the other places, tangible and intangible, and where Confederate or where Civil War memory, to use your phrase, can be felt. And this is wonderful timing for me. I'm actually teaching this semester a class on Civil War memory. So
Okay.
we just started our semester on Tuesday. So that this book is out that we've worked on for so long, and I'm incredibly proud of it to be able to take some of these conversations into the classroom. And I tell my students, and I'm sure they think this is tongue in cheek, and I'm over the top about it, and I'm being hyperbolic, but I'm not. I'm incredibly serious. The Civil War is our nation's most important, divisive, and defining event. It simply is. And so many aspects of our country today can be traced directly to that 4-year conflict in 1861 to 1865. So when you start to see, I told my students this just today, I said, when you start to see the Civil War, when you like open your eyes to seeing it in all these different places, you'll never be able to unsee it
That's
because it
a-
is everywhere. Robert, the quote is correct. The Robert Penn Warren quote. It is our felt history. We have an insatiable appetite for the Civil War, and we should do justice to understanding. 700,000 Americans died in that conflict, and what legacy have they left us? What legacy do we have from them?
Yeah. And to me, it's so fascinating because, we can't even agree on what to call it necessarily. So then, as we start arguing over what it means and what our memories are of it, I mean, it gets complicated right from the beginning. You and I know people who still call it the War of Northern Aggression or the War of Secession or the War of Rebellion or the War between the states. I mean, like, we can't even agree necessarily on the name of the event. And so then how do you have a discussion when you can't even have a common vocabulary? You know? So John, one doesn't necessarily think of Oklahoma as a hotbed of Civil War action, although there was, Indian Territory and the final Confederate surrender out there. So what was it like for you being geographically placed at the beginning of this book discussion and like, I've got to kind of find my way through a new topic in a geography that's, maybe kind of foreign to all of this. It must have been a little bit of stranger in a strange land, I would think.
A little bit, certainly. Thankfully, I had Jen, as always, who was also here at the time and to help guide me, And uh, the, on the one hand, coming at this from an outsider, as an outsider, and if you look at my books, like you can always find some reference to the Civil War, some discussions at some level, but so it was not something, but it allowed me, I think, a sense of freedom, but even maybe a sense that, you know, uh, I was less constrained by kind of this century of historiography that I didn't know, and so, certain debates. So I kind of went into some questions thinking, oh, what about this or what about that? Or how do I understand that? I will give you one, speaking of coming at this from an Oklahoman's perspective, and it's strange to think of myself that way, but so my chapter involved the sort of historical legacy of Dylan Roof and basically how he mobilized this sense of Confederate memory in service to his to provide a kind of ideological armor for his crime. So what I wound up doing was going and basically following his Civil War tour of South Carolina. He basically went to all of these different monuments and various things like in the lead up to the 2015 Charleston massacre. So I decided to see, well, what would that have been like? And so the first thing I wound up doing was going to a Confederate museum, and it was a museum of Confederate history and in South Carolina. And when I went in there, I didn't announce that I was a historian. I didn't announce that I was a writing this, researching this. I just kind of went in as a ordinary person. And one of the docents who worked there, who was dressed entirely in gray, right? The first thing he said to me was, you know, you know, uh, uh, it wasn't the bullet that killed Lincoln, right? It was the surgeons that did it. And I was like, oh, okay. Like I hadn't heard that. But he took a liking to me for some reason, and he decided to show me all around. And when he asked where I was from, I said I'm from Oklahoma, and he's like, oh, hey boys, like Oklahoma. It's like, in Oklahoma, right? All the Indian tribes, they fought for the Confederacy, right? And so soon I was holding this rifle and like, doing all these things, and he proceeded to give me a history lesson. And he made this, the fact that I was from Oklahoma and came all the way from Oklahoma there, like, was really intriguing to him. But he told me this thing that has with me ever since, which was, he said, there are some people out there who don't believe that the Holocaust happened, right? And he's like, can you believe that there are people out there dumb enough they don't believe the Holocaust happened? Um, it's the same thing with us, right? There are some people who don't believe in the crimes committed against the South Carolina people. And so we have to fight, right? We can't let people forget, right? And it really struck me, both, I guess I was happy to learn that he believed that the Holocaust, it happened. But the fact that he sort of took that as a way for him to sort of, make this argument about memory is not something that just sort of happens, that you need to fight for memory, right? You need places like this Confederate museum to exist, right? Because otherwise, people would not understand. And he told me all of these things about Lincoln, but that I was, people don't understand. But just this, he was dead set on this idea that and it was almost existential. If we don't like teach the next generation this memory, right? Um, it will it will be a crime. It will be further violence against those who suffered in the past, right? So you know, sometimes we kind of think that when it comes to memory, we're trying to um, all history is revisionist, right? And we're trying to kind of bring in new voices. Well, it's important that, no matter where you sit on these kinds of debates, right? There's this, the one thing that brings people together is this idea that memory is not just something that just happens, right? It's profound, it's political, and it is worth fighting for.
It's interesting, hearing that story because that certainly imbues what he's doing with a sense of noble purpose. Whether it's
Oh yeah.
accurate or not, there's still, from his perspective, there's that real sense of urgency and purpose, which is interesting to me because it sounds like that feeds into this notion of partisanship because there's a emotional charge to it that might not otherwise exist. And before we get into the specific essays, I'd like to ask each of you to kind of speak to that overall context of the book because you talk about polarized America. This isn't just about Civil War memory, but that polarization is a really key ingredient to the way you approach this. Jen, let me have you start with you, and then I'll ask John to respond as well. But tell me about that context.
So I would answer that question by sort of pointed to some of the issues that we bring up in the epilogue. Certainly since 2015, 2016, amplified again in 2020, our nation is incredibly polarized along obvious political fractures and political lines. And an undercurrent to that, or a weaponization of that, I guess, is American history and often Civil War history. And you will see politicians of all political stripes and persuasions employ Civil War references to meet their particular agenda or particular purpose. The Civil War is incredibly politically malleable. There's a photograph in our book of Barack Obama with Abraham Lincoln behind him, which was really iconic in the early years of Barack Obama's tenure. And you see more recent references to the ways in which President Trump has appropriated my favorite Civil War battle, of course, which is Gettysburg, when he very famously uses the never fight uphill, me boys quip in this ridiculously confusing Irish accent, evidently to appropriate a memory of Robert E. Lee and the futility of Pickett's charge. So, we see the polarization of our national landscape, and then underneath that is the ways in which Civil War memory is being manipulated. And as John just articulated, and as he experienced in his Dylan Roof chapter and his journey, is it has to be created and perpetuated, and it's used and misused and abused. And as a Civil War historian, we have a duty to be part of that conversation. So when you see National Park Service sites peeling back particular exhibits on Harriet Tubman, or changes in textual displays at a John Brown museum here in Harper's Ferry, or in way in which we think about slavery as not a cause, but the cause to the American Civil War, we have a duty to confront those questions. We, as I said in my last response, I mean, we owe it to the men and the women who fought for democracy and liberty in the 1860s conflict to make sure that that story is told, and not to get so lost in these political debates that we lose sight of what happened and what those stakes were. Because, and we write about this in the book, the stakes of Civil War memory are very real and they're very high, and we need to take that seriously. We have a duty to do so.
Super urgent, I think, because of the way people try to appropriate it and get us to believe one thing or another based on that. John, what's your take on that notion of partisanship and the emotional charge it brings?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, this is the hard part about being a historian, because you can always say, like, well, haven't we always been polarized? And in many ways, yes. Like I like to tell my students that, when it comes to America, Americans don't agree on anything, right? They don't agree on taxes, they don't agree on immigration, they don't agree on race, gender, class. Like we don't agree on it, and that's okay. And yet it feels like there are moments in which those kind of natural disagreements, the kinds of things that you would expect in a democracy, right? In which disagreement is good, turns into something else, right? And the why the Civil War is so important, not just as a, historical event, but as a symbol, as a metaphor, as a framework for understanding the present, is because, it offers us a vision of what it looks like when that disagreement turns into something else, right? Not just violence, but a kind of organized violence and a way of, you know, a kind of fracture that in many ways endangers the nation. Right? Now, uh, you could say that in the 1950s, America felt the same way. The civil rights movement and throughout the Vietnam War, the same way. And yet, and I can't help but, I was just, reading the 2020 book, How the South Won the Civil War, looking at kind of the references to the liberal consensus of the Cold War, starting around 2000 with the Iraq War, or, 9/11, but especially since 2016, it feels like we are in a different place. And there are all these kinds of things you can point to, whether it's January 6th, whether it's what's going on right now in Minneapolis, where, I got my PhD. And so I'm, very attuned to that, where it feels like we are slipping toward or accelerating toward that something else. I, I teach about this a lot, and I tell my students, look, when you hear people say like, "Oh, we're on the verge of a civil war," we're not, or at least we're not on the verge of something that looks like the war of the mid 19th century, but we are on the verge of something, right? And that something, political polarization is not just a fact, right? Political polarization provides a framework for understanding facts, right? And political polarization, as we just saw uh, uh, in the murder of Renee Good, it provides us with a lens through which to see this event, right? And we're at a place where we can't kind of look at these events in the same way. And that's, I think, is dangerous, it's scary, it's bad for democracy. And what's really important about that is that, again, as I said, when people are grappling around for how do I make sense of these divisions, again and again, as we show through the book and our great contributors show, is that the thing they keep landing on is this civil war. But what they do to it when they reappropriate, when they turn it into something that it wasn't, right? And as a historian, that troubles me, but also as an American living in the 21st century, that troubles me as well, because I think what they often don't do, um, when people evoke Civil War, Civil War, I can't wait. They lose sense of the carnage, of the death, of the suffering, of the long-term grief, the changing attitudes toward death, my first book was on disabled veterans, right? And so I'm always keen on kind of the material after effects of war. And so when, I get so frustrated when I hear people kind of blithely and flippantly evoke the Civil War without really coming to terms with like, literally, what does it mean to kill 700,000 people in a span of 4 years and injure millions more, right? Like, that's centuries worth of trauma. And so I just think it's so dangerous to kind of talk about these things without really grappling with the event.
Yeah, I spent some time in Rwanda, not long, but kind of getting a sense of what their civil war looks like, really terrifies me when people today are like, "Oh yeah, another civil war, let's get on with this." Because like, when you have gangs of people with machetes going through neighborhoods, just house to house, neighbor versus neighbor, like that's the kind of ugliness because we don't have a nice, neat Mason-Dixon line, North and South, the way kind of people romanticize the Civil War as being once upon a time. Like, there's ugliness to it that I think that memory often obscures because, of course, as part of memory is that great sentimentalization, is that a word, that we often do as we're looking back on those memories. And we forget that ugliness and that material stuff that you're just talking about, which I think adds to that urgency that Jen had mentioned a few minutes ago. Um, let me read a quote here from my friend John Hennessy. Great book blurb for you guys. He says, "This is a book of history like few others, a bold step in the evolution of our understanding of the Civil War. Courageous and sometimes provocative, these essays push us to consider the past in the present." And that, I think, maybe is a good transition for us to run through our lineup of contributors for the book here that you guys have. Jen, I know you've got a copy of the book with you. John, I don't know if you have one with you, but can you just give us a quick rundown of who's in the book and what they have written about?
Jen, do you want to?
Sure. Do you want to? I would just go maybe chapter and topic.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Is that a good way to handle it, Chris?
Yeah.
So we have a total of 12 chapters. That's me and John and 10. The first chapter is Brooks Simpson writing on Reconstruction's reverberations in 21st century America. Familiar name to a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, with his contributions on Grant and his writing on Reconstruction.
Sure.
Tim Galsworthy is writing on the Republican Party, the lost cause, and the transformation of American politics. Tim just published a book on this topic, actually, also, which is great.
In fact, I just spoke with him yesterday, and his episode will air right after this one. So we'll have an extended look into his essay coming up.
Perfect timing. The third chapter is mine, and I worked on the 9 U.S. Army bases and the stripping of the names of Confederate officers and that story, and then sort of the modern take on that now that we have renamed them the same surname, but not after the Confederate officer. So that was a very timely and relevant piece to work on. Doing modern history as a Civil War historian was an interesting exercise in trying to keep up with all this stuff as it unfolded. And we have our books like in page proofs, and there's still things that are going on. We can't make any more changes, man. Our friend, a friend of the emerging Civil War, Steve Fann, who was the chief of interpretation down at Camp Nelson, wrote a chapter on Civil War and relevancy at Camp Nelson. Josh Wolf wrote a chapter on the lynching of George Johnson, which occurs in Kansas. Joey Thompson wrote a chapter on Civil War memory and modern country music. He's a professor in Mississippi State. Sarah Handler Cousins, who teaches at SUNY Buffalo, wrote a chapter on Civil War memory and modern romance novels. And this is, an example with those two there, where John and I were really deliberate, as we both said, and not talking about the questions of monuments, but looking at all these other aspects where you see Confederate memory, Civil War memory highlighted. Chapter 8 is on clothing. It's called Dixie Chicks. It's hoodies in Confederate exceptionalism, and that's by a professor at the University of Richmond named Nicole Marianto. Scott Hancock, who teaches at Gettysburg College, wrote a chapter on Gettysburg and the Black Lives Matter equation, which really amplified there in the summer of 2020. Scott was deeply and personally involved in that. Kevin Levin wrote a chapter on the myth of Black Confederates. Kevin, of course, published a book on that some years ago and is really an authority on that topic. Brett Barnett, who is at Slippery Rock, wrote a chapter on the Confederate battle flag and its appropriation and uses over time. And then John, as he mentioned, did an excellent chapter on Dylann Roof and following the sites and places in which Dylann Roof visited in advance of the 2020 murders. So one thing, and this was the great collaboration between John and I, since we came from different backgrounds, as we talked about, was getting not a lineup that was exclusively Civil War historians, but bringing in scholars who worked in communication department, or bringing in scholars who work in 20th century topics, or their specialization is in music, for instance, and the history of country music. We have public historians and independent scholars in our books. So I think one of the real strengths is that it showcases, because it is rooted in an interdisciplinary approach, just how diverse and eclectic questions of Civil War memory really are.
John, are any of those folks from your Rolodex?
Um, a few. I
Yeah.
mean, there were. I know Sarah Henley Cousins because I reviewed her great book on disabled veterans
Okay.
of the Union Civil War, Bodies in Blue. And, so when I asked her, I had sort of suggested her, maybe thinking she would do something on, I didn't know what she would say. And when she said she wanted to write about modern romance novels, I was thrilled because, again, this is, as Jen said, this is exactly the sort of thing that we were looking for, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many the 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 Confederate monument debate is everywhere, and we tried not to talk about it, but of course it gets into the book, right? It's impossible not, but we were really interested in the idea that the Civil War memory was happening in some expected and unexpected places as well. And this is something that I kind of came, so as a historian of war and society, I mentioned that I wrote a book on disabled veterans. My latest book is about zoos during World War II.
Oh,
And, so I was very much interested in like, where does war affect, where does war leave its mark? Like, well, it leaves its mark on the bodies of injured people, right? But where's an unexpected place where war leaves its mark? And so I'm always interested in those kinds of places. And when she said, there are a lot of romance novels that are about Civil War, and she's able to do this remarkable job of showing how to in the 70s, there's this peak of interest in Civil War romances, and then they disappear. And now they're back, but only in very specific forms, Christian inspirational Civil War themed romances and African American Civil War romances, or Civil War romances written by African American authors. And so looking at how kind of the Civil War as a framework, as a setting, can be used for all different kinds of ways, right? With different political inclinations, different sort of messages about race and about power and about slavery. And I think that's one thing about the Civil War that's so interesting, particularly as an outsider, is that on the one hand, you can make a Civil War drama or Civil War art that reinforces, specific, traditions or hierarchies in America, right? But of course, the Civil War is all about breaking those things up, right? Destroying those things. And so, Civil War art, Civil War literature, can be a kind of Civil War song, can be an inspiration for movements that are trying to transform America even today. And so I love that chapter, right? And I like Nicole Morantonio's chapter on hoodies and like the subtle ways in which certain kinds of brands kind of sell Confederate exceptionalism, which is her term she developed, right? Through the use of clothing, and Joseph Thompson on Civil War music. Like, so, we're interested in these places that are, brick and mortar, or these important places like the bases that Jen talks about, but we're really also interested in those other places, the things we wouldn't necessarily think about, and we're able to kind of get some of that stuff in as well through the vignettes that we use in setting up the different sections and that sort of thing. Yeah.
yeah. Jen, as you worked through the collection and you're kind of curating the content, what jumped out at you as a fun surprise or something that was really, like, oh wow, this is exciting.
I think I maybe just echo a little bit about what John said, is just how broad of a collection we have assembled. And I appreciate collaborating on this with John because it really was this perfect kind of background of co-editing because I'm so deeply anchored in 1861 to 1865 that sometimes that just so much perverses my views. But to have someone like John, who is a 20th century scholar of war and society, to sort of pull me out of the 1860s, that we could get this broad framework, I think is just wonderful, and it absolutely accomplishes what I felt way back in the fall of 2021 was my vision for the book, is to showcase these diverse and eclectic ways in which the Civil War memory is apparent today. I mean, how many people would expect to pick up a book like this and read a chapter on clothing, on hoodies? So I hope that the readers and students perhaps in classrooms who engage with this topic will be surprised and shocked, as John said, at the obvious, but also the least obvious ways in which Civil War memory is apparent in modern America.
It seems too that at least some of these essays engage on a couple different levels, kind of getting back to that emotional charge of partisanship, where, like the base names essay that you worked on, or the music essay, where, people probably have opinions about the base names, but then there's also like a military culture that has its own sort of connections to that history that people have some emotional feelings about that, if you're not part of the military, you maybe not you don't have the same perspective, or like people are always attracted to the emotional connection they have with music. And so like lots of different layers of emotional connection with some of these topics it seems that you guys have tackled.
Mhm.
What was that like to try to parse through that, Jim?
To be sure, the base renaming chapter was fascinating to write. And, my early work, my Gettysburg book, is rooted in questions of Civil War memory. But to sort of live through the recent iteration of this was incredibly fascinating. And for all the controversy about Confederate monuments, long ago, it has always struck me that we need to talk about the bases, the U.S. Army bases. Why do we have bases in our country where men and women train named after men who took up arms against the United States of America? That is antithetical to what the United States Army should be promoting and what it should be standing for, what I hope it stands for. So my essay is certainly grounded in the origins of those names, a lot of them which come out of World War I and later also World War II. Questions of racial integration and segregation run through that particular chapter, but then also most recently is the naming commission. Ty Sedgley, who wrote a book called Robert E. Lee and Me, he's been very vocal on the renaming issue. Ty Sedgley chaired that commission. They did a tremendous amount of work at a large expense, and a lot of hours went into deliberately selecting names, nine, for these nine bases that represent the values of the U.S. Army today. And the U.S. Army today is the most diverse workforce in our country. So when you have a base in southwestern Georgia named after Henry Benning, an enslaver and one of the biggest promoters of secession in 1860 and 1861, goes on to serve in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, that has been renamed after Hal and Julia Moore, the famous movie that Mel Gibson does, We Were Soldiers Once and Young. Julia Moore instrumental in reshaping how casualties, families are notified if your loved one dies in Vietnam. We renamed the base Fort Hal and Julia Moore, stripping it from Henry Benning, and now it is once again named Fort Benning, but not after Henry Benning, but a person who has the same surname but does not have a Confederate connection to. So even in this recent iteration of this, and that's what I said earlier, like going through page proofs as all these new decrees are coming out and all these new changes are going on was incredibly nerve-wracking to me. But it showcases just how timely this is. And as you said, Chris, very emotionally charged. Just reading the comments when the base, like Fort Liberty in North Carolina, just how emotionally charged that question is. I served at these bases. It should always be named this.
Right.
Um, it's just
Right.
great. What a fun topic to explore. And I have no doubt that reading our book will evoke so many of these passionate debates that we're talking about here today.
Yeah, I can't wait to get a chance to take a look at it. And of course, I always wonder, like, why would you name a base after Braxton Bragg in the first place? I mean, just it's Braxton Bragg for crying out loud. Yeah. Yeah. So as we
Yeah.
get ready to wrap up, John, let me ask you, as you wrapped up this project, you've got a physical copy in your hand. Um, what did this project help you reconsider or think about differently? What are you as a scholar walking away from this project with?
Uh, I two things, right? One sort of personal and one kind of just as a broader question for, how I think about war in society, right? Because on the one hand, as Jen pointed out, or it's really been made clear, we don't treat the Civil War the way we treat other wars, right? There's no way that the United States would have, bases named after German generals, for example. Like it's just unthinkable, right? Like why would we do that? And, the answer, of course, is that for a good chunk of the American population, right, didn't, or they don't remember it as a war of insurrection or secession, right? They don't see their family as the enemy of the United States, right? They claim it, right? They claim it and they claim it for all different kinds of ways. Um, and to even sort of challenge a certain kind of interpretation of the war is, not just, a kind of academic matter, but it's a personal matter, right? You are at some level potentially insulting their family members, their ancestors, them on some level, right? So to even think about the Civil War and to talk about the Civil War is, potentially disrupting, confrontational. I mean, the only time, one of the very few times I've ever been, confronted after a public talk, um, was after I made a crack about the Confederacy, in a talk about disabled veterans. And someone came up to me afterwards and, finger in my face saying, "Hey, you can't say that, you are, so like that's real." And so, at some level, I think it's no wonder that people are so kind of invested in this. Just as so many other people are invested in it, as a kind of potential turning point in what America could be, right? America, if you sort of believe that the story of America is a story about certain ideals and that we don't live up to, right? But the Civil War is like one moment where potentially we're getting closer. And then in 1965, potentially we're getting closer and it's back, but we're always on that arc. The Civil War is central to that question. For me as an individual, I kind of learned a new technique. One thing that I did as a scholar that I hadn't done before, I kind of, looked at where Dylan Roof went, and then I visited, right? So I visited a Confederate graveyard, right, in Columbia, and I visited a number of plantations that he went to, and I talked to the historical interpreters there. And I talked to them about like what it was like, and I kind of did this sort of man on the ground style of not quite reporting, but here's my experience like coming into this place, and here's my experience talking to them, and here's my experience at the music. And I took away from that. I really enjoy doing that, and that's something. I'm pretty much a before this, someone who spent a lot of time in the archives, and so. For my next, my current book project, I've kind of incorporated a lot more of that sort of quasi-reporting, quasi kind of experiential type of, doing history work. And so in that sense, I'm still struck with this big, kind of question of what is the Civil War? Why do we care? And why is it so, why is it so important? But I'm also, on an individual scholarly level, like I'm interested in sort of, doing this opened the door for me to do other kinds of things as well.
Yeah. So like instead of Confederates in the attic, it's like Oklahoman in the Confederacy. Is that
Yeah, a
kind of what you're
little
trying to
bit,
say? Okay.
and I should say, like, I mean, I love Confederates in the Attic. That's one of those books that you sort of look at and think, like, how could I do something like
Yeah.
that? What would I do? And then you think, like, wow, this seems dangerous. Like this is, I don't know if I'm the sort of person to kind of to hang out with these guys. Like maybe I'll just stick to the archive.
Jen, how about you? What was your big takeaway after finishing this? What has it given you to think about?
Um, I would just sort of maybe come back to a couple points that I've hit all evening is how deeply and broadly and how eclectic Civil War memory is in modern culture. And I hope my students become aware of this semester in a Civil War memory class. I hope people that pick up our book become aware of the impact of Civil War memory in modern culture. And as we've talked about a little bit, when rhetoric becomes inflamed and emotions are very raw and reactions are very visceral to things, just to maybe breathe and step back before employing very dangerous comparisons to the Civil War, or thinking about, or lusting about, or romanticizing about the Civil War. Because, and I said this to my students in class today, over 700,000 Americans died during the Civil War. That's 2% of the population in 1860. And if the United States would get involved in a war today with China or Russia or Venezuela or whomever, and if we today in 2026 would see 2% of our servicemen and women dead, that would be about 7 million Americans. I'm from the state of Maryland. I currently live right across the Potomac River in Maryland, and my state population is just over 6 million. So, as a point of reference, think about every single person living in Maryland from far western Garrett County, where I grew up, down through Baltimore and Annapolis, down the Eastern Shore, dead in 4 years. That's the American Civil War. That's its legacy. So
Yeah.
when we think about the Civil War memory and modern culture and those kind of analogies, my gosh, I really just urge kind of caution and thinking about those kind of dangerous parallels, thinking about what life was like in 1861 and 1865 and those legacies that those Americans left us.
Yeah. A great reminder of the urgency to find that common vocabulary so that we can have that common framework for discussion so that we can find that common ground. Wonderful, wonderful thoughts. The book is called They Are Dead and Yet They Live, Civil War Memories in a Polarized America, edited by John Kinder and Jen Murray from the University of Nebraska Press. Congratulations to both of you on the publication.
Thanks, Chris.
So
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having us and giving us a chance to talk about our book. Always a pleasure.
likewise, thanks for being with us. I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.